Good afternoon. This is Corinne Tycher, and I am Pauline Gravier. I am a volunteer with the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, and this is September the 23rd, 2013. And Corinne, would you tell us and share with us something about coming to Dallas, or if you want, about your life before you came to Dallas? Give us a short background.
Well, I'm going to give you a quick Depression background. I was born prior to the Depression, but was a small child in Chicago. And my grandfather, who had a great deal of spirit in him, the father of 5 sons, decided to come to Dallas in 1930 with 1 son, 2 sons. And that is how I got to Dallas.
And what was his name?
His name was Max Feldman, F-E-L-D-M-A-N. And brothers Dave, Morris, Lou, Harry, Dave, Morris, Lou, Harry, Sam.
And did they all come to Dallas?
They came, but gradually. 2 came at the time when my grandfather came. My father did not come. So I stayed in Chicago until 1935, when we came to Dallas. We lived most of it in South Dallas. My elementary school was right across the street from where we lived because my mother did not drive.
And where was that?
That was Brown School on Park Row off of Oakland. And that was I graduated, if you will, from that school. I was also, by the way, the editor, which began my journalistic career, of the Brown News. And my sister, who was just a year younger, of course, was with us when we came. And then the State Fair was in 1936, and I just thought that was the most wonderful thing I had ever seen.
Well, you were walking distance down to the fairgrounds.
Exactly. And I stayed at Brown, as I say, until I graduated. By 1938, all of the sons, the other 2, also made their way to Dallas, with one of them going to Fort Worth. 4 of them lived in Dallas. It
sounds like you were part of a very close family.
Close family. The brothers are very close, and they were in the women's ready-to-wear, was the family occupation. And in fact, the store that my mother had in Chicago was called the Corinne Style Shop. Anyway, all the brothers finally came here by 1938. They were all here. And my grandfather was a furrier. And so he opened Parisian Fur Company. It was on Bryant Street and Haskell, right across from the telephone exchange, Southwestern Bell, which of course that was not automated in those days, and there were literally thousands of women that worked there. So that's why they decided to open right across the street. And so it was Parisian Fur Company. My father was not a furrier. There was only 1 son that followed that was a furrier also. But there were other things to do. And, but the other ones opened up a women's clothing store, because that's what they knew. My uncle in Fort Worth, and Harry eventually, the younger one. And so I graduated Brown, and of course in those days there was only one high school to go to, Forest. I went to Forest and spent my 4 years at Forest. In the meantime, my parents had bought several small dress shops, all Beaumont, Corpus Christi, so they had a small chain. Not very big and not a high finance, but that's what they had. They had several stores in Dallas. They bought a store in Oak Cliff called Peyton's. and hence came the name Parisian Paytons, because Parisian, the name, had been here much, much longer, and they didn't want to totally give it up. The war came. Impossible to get men to sell furs. So my mother, not that she sold furs particularly, but she went to work. And that was the first time that my mother, since she had the little shop in Chicago where we used to be in the buggy, worked away from home. And they couldn't get furs during the war years, so they began to carry dresses. And then they began to have men's clothing. I, in the meantime, have graduated high school, pretty good student, not the best. I also was editor of the Forest Echo, because as I say, I had decided that my life's work would be in journalism. I was the only high school press that interviewed Barkley when he was running for vice president. I was the only, as I said, I was in high school, and it was at the Baker Hotel, and here are all these people from the main newspapers and magazines, and there I was. I had 3 questions prepared to ask, and he patted me on the head, Mr. Barkley, and he liked my questions, and I told him that I was interested in journalism. And that was my first really decision of what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. But of course, I graduated high school. The war was on, 1944. The war was on, and there really wasn't much of anything, including men. I went to the center had a USO branch, Jewish branch. So I met some fellas, but other than that, there was not a whole lot of social life. I had planned to go to the University of Missouri. That is the finest, still is today, the finest undergraduate program in journalism. But with no fellas anywhere, no social life anywhere, I decided I best stay home. So I started SMU as a major in journalism. At that time, journalism was very much mistreated at SMU. We were in the basement of McFarland Auditorium, terrible. And then they had a B12 program there, and I met a cute guy, and so I had some social life when I was at SMU. Then one day, I get a call. This is in 1946. I get a call, and the young voice says, "Is this Corinne Tycher?" I says, "Yes, it is." He says, "Well, my dad knows your uncle." And that's how Fred and I met.
So from Chicago, it was a Chicago connection.
Exactly. He knew my uncle. And this uncle had 2 boys, never had, they had sons. Most of the brothers were very few girls in the family. And I was the oldest. And my Uncle Lou, who doted on me, and Fred saw my picture on his piano, one of those very glamorous, the kind over the shoulder, and he said, "Who is that?" And my uncle says, "That's my niece. I will introduce you, and she'll introduce you to all the young people, in the community."
He was coming to live in Dallas?
No, he was in the Army.
In the Army?
He was in Paris, Texas.
Okay.
It was a temporary, wartime base.
Mm-hmm.
And he couldn't get a room in a hotel one weekend coming in. And he says to this non-Jewish young man he was with, Fred related this to me later, he said, he says, "I have a card that my dad gave me." He said, "There's some fellow living in Dallas that my dad said, if you ever need anything, I should call him." And that was my Uncle Lou. And so he called him. And that's how he saw my picture. And, we dated, but just a few months, because he was sent to the Army of Occupation in Japan. And we corresponded, but not much. And, but he was so good looking, 6'1½", just really, really good looking man. And I've always liked tall men, so I thought, wow, he's really something special. But time passed. And he came home from the service and invited me to come to Chicago. Well, in those days, single girls didn't go to visit fellas. Today, it would be considered nothing. But in those days, so my parents said, no, you can't go. And the following summer, my uncle, same uncle, says to me, you know, he still had family in Chicago. He says, I'm going up to Chicago. You want to come with us and you can see the young man again? So I thought, wow. So I said, sure, it's great. So anyway, I did. And we spent 2 weeks together. Not together as today. I stayed in the hotel with my uncle. And came home with already, this is 1946, came home already with a very, really heartfelt feeling for Fred. And he likewise. I mean, we just happened to hit it off. And so he came to Dallas in August. We were there in June. And spent some time together. And he had a ring in a box. And I opened the box and it was a huge stone from the dime store. Of course, he didn't have much money by then, you know, with the army and everything. But, you know, we went through the whole parody of, oh, it's so gorgeous. And he was on his knee, and as I say, it was a dime store ring. But in a velvet box, I might add. And so this was 47 already. And he went back to Chicago. And, you know, I still have stacks of letters to this day that we wrote each other in the interim 2 months. And we were engaged in November of 1947 at an engagement party at the Stoneleigh Hotel. And December, because Fred's brother was still in college, and so we had to get married at a time where he was at fall break. Mm-hmm. And so we were married December 23rd, 1947 in Dallas, Texas. Fred had not turned 21 yet. January, he would have been 21. My birthday being in December, was, of course, Fred's dad had to sign, because in those days, the male had to be 21 to get a marriage license. Of course, later it went down to 18, I think, but it didn't then. And of course, Fred's dad, throughout his life, always teased me, if it wouldn't have been for my signature, you couldn't have married Fred.
That's pretty young, even for those days, to have a man that young.
And as I say, he turned 21, so we're 11 months apart, Fred and I. So we were technically born the same year. And he chose, I would have, you know, gone to Chicago. His father had owned some apartment buildings, so real estate was not, you know, not unknown to Fred. He said he swept many upstairs when the snow fell for his father in the apartments that his dad owned. Anyway, but he said he'd rather start out as a small fish, you know, in a bigger pond, but not too big, and he felt Chicago was not a place for him to start.
Let me ask you, what did Fred do after he came home from Japan?
He went to college.
Where was that?
In Chicago.
Okay.
And one of the things that bothered Fred was that men were already, men, and now he was still very young, as you can see, and he felt left behind, you know, that other men were men, and had already begun their life's work, because not everybody went to college in those days. But he did go. He went for a year, but it bothered him later in life that he didn't finish college, and consequently he was an avid reader. And I think part of the reason that he liked biographies and things like that, because it was the real world, and he could learn through reading. He had a better vocabulary than I did with my college, because it was that important to him, and my kids knew it. So it became important to everybody. So he, after we got married in December, the following year, 1948, we moved to Amarillo, Texas, because my parents had, as I said before, had opened up stores, and there was a store that they had opened up in Amarillo. So we went. No children, and you know, no family, no anybody. We didn't know a soul in Amarillo. And well, we went. Fred went first, and I, in the meantime, was working. I was a legal stenographer, not knowing much, but I could type. And I went to the library to study the shorthand that had legal. I knew regular shorthand. So I worked for a Jewish uncle and nephew in Fort Worth, because we were living in Fort Worth at the time. And the one I worked for, he just started this practice with his uncle. His uncle was not happy that I was from Dallas, because they had a lot of clients. I can remember the uncle not lecturing, but reminding me, like they say today, what happens in Nevada and stays, or whatever they say. And it was the same thing of his. He was a lovely man, the one I worked, and he was very patient, because he didn't know, as far as verbiage, much more than I did. And so I worked there for 9 months and didn't get pregnant at the end of 9 months. But I told my husband, I told Fred, I can't leave. He left in February. I said, I can't. I'm going to stay until I give ample notice and until you get us settled in Amarillo. To me, that was the end of the world. And so he did. He came back, picked me up, and we had an apartment near TCU in Fort Worth. And, you know, very small, with the walls so thin, because it was built prior to the end of the war. And we had a wonderful neighbor next door, Willie, who worked for the Fort Worth newspaper. And whenever we wanted to talk to each other, we would just knock on the wall, you know, and that meant come over, because it was paper thin. But that was our first apartment. I still have the key to that apartment, I might add. And then we moved to Amarillo, where we knew no one. And it was, he hadn't found us a place to live, because he had been busy. So we lived in a hotel. Have you ever tried doing wash in a hotel sink? Not good. And we lived in the hotel for several months while we looked for a house. And Fred, with his GI Bill, we were able to afford, I might add, because money was scarce. Fred had made, you know, nothing in the service, and of course was trying to be in school when he got out. So he had little nothing. And a funny aside, he had a cousin that was in the diamond market in Chicago. And I knew Fred well enough. He calls me before he selects the ring, because he's going to get it wholesale. And he says, you have a choice, he tells me on the phone. You can have a larger, this was Fred's philosophy, period. You can have a larger stone, but it has a flaw deep inside, but it's big. Or you can have right under a carat stone, perfect blue white diamond. And I knew Fred well enough, and I said, oh, of course the perfect stone. And that was Fred's philosophy. What you do well. What you have, And, you know, that showed Fred to me early in our marriage.
What a wonderful philosophy.
He continued that literally all his life, you know, in everything or anything he did. And as I say, my kids were fortunate. That's all they saw was, you know, in anything they did. And anyway, Linda was born in Amarillo. She's not too happy. She just says she was born in Texas when someone asked her. I said, Linda, Amarillo was a nice little town. No, she didn't want to tell anybody she was born in Amarillo. And when Linda was 3, we came back to Dallas.
And now what was Fred doing in Amarillo?
Amarillo, he was running what he renamed, which was one of the Lucille, which was his mother's name, the Lucille Style Shop.
Okay.
It was an existing store that had been there since the 30s. And there were salespeople that were as old as Fred's grandmother. You know what I'm saying? Because he was very young. He was very young. So we lived there 4 years, you know, made friends and, you know, had a nice, wonderful life. Remember, we only had 1 car. But I only had help in the house, only a half day, 1 time a week, so it really worked out. So we moved back. And then I was pregnant with Michelle, second daughter. He said, the doctor said, don't fly. I'd rather you take the train. And so I took the train. We came to Dallas in October. And he had recommended a friend of his from medical school that was practicing in Dallas. He called him and said, I'm sending you, you know, a patient. And Michelle was born 4 weeks later. So, you know, that was, but by then I had made contact with a lot of old friends.
And were your mother and father still living?
Oh yeah, mother and father were still here, living. And, you know, I had a lot of old friends since I went to SMU and Forest. And, you know, my life was actually spent in Dallas, most of my life.
Sure.
The others were little sojourns into, you know, other places. But, you know, Dallas was my home. My mother says when they came in 1935, the population of Dallas was 180,000 people. So to her, it was a small town compared to Chicago. But in later years, as Dallas got bigger and bigger, my mother always used to say, well, it's really caught up with me. I'm living in a big city again. So, but they loved Dallas, and they had lots of friends. And
did your mother ever work?
Only during the time of the war.
Right.
My mother played mahjong, which is very popular today. She rode a bicycle for exercise. And so she but she still, you know, once you get in the habit of working, and we grew up, she still worked. She enjoyed it. They called her Miss Rose. And they called my father Mr. Dave, never called them by their last names. And they were little people. My mother was 4'10" and a half, and my father was like 5'3". So they were little, loving people, and all the customers loved them. And so, you know, they enjoyed, my father had no hobbies. I mean, he worked until he died. And my mother, other than, you know, raising kids and cooking, and as I say, playing mahjong, and they had no hobbies.
Did they remain in Dallas? I mean, in South Dallas?
No.
They moved?
When I was in it must have been my junior year in high school at Forest, I, you know, met people, and I have to say some of it was vanity. I admit, you know, if someone really asked me the question, because I didn't want to live in South Dallas anymore. My uncle, my benevolent uncle, the one that fixed everything for me, he had moved to University Park. And my folks had never owned, they had always lived in apartments. And when he moved to University Park, it kind of, churned. And I thought, my parents should live in University Park too. So I began to, was able to make my point even at a young age, vehemently almost, but not vehement. But I convinced my parents that we too should move to University Park. And so one time we went to look, and I can remember so clearly, University Park, and there was no Colgate. University Park ended practically like at Southwestern, open land beyond, going north, really. And I can remember my dad was upset. I'm nervous about this. And I say, why? He says, because if I'm busy at night, 3 women, I leave and you're facing the country. He says, I don't like that. He says, we have to look somewhere else. So we did. We went south in University Park and bought a house on Hanover.
On Hanover?
On Hanover,
that
which was way south.
Highland Park.
No, Hanover is university.
Oh, okay.
Purdue, all the universities, the streets
Right.
are named after university. And so, by the time I never went to Highland Park because I didn't want to transfer. Because, by the time we got the house,
I was wondering.
a senior.
Sure.
And so I finished at Forest, and then, never had anything to do with the schools in University Park.
Sure.
And then, of course, but the irony of things, my mother lost her whole, she thought at the time, early, that she lost her whole family. She had a grandmother in the Holocaust. She had a grandmother and a grandfather. And she had 2 younger brothers. They sent my mother away. My mother came via Cuba, and she was 18, because the Russians were bothering them. The Cossacks would cross over into Poland. My mother was a cute little thing, and she sang beautifully. In fact, in Chicago, she sang on the Jewish Hour. So she had a lovely voice, and she relates to me that they would, put her on the table and make her sing. Anyway, her parents were very concerned. But she couldn't get into the United States, where there were relatives. But anyway, they were able to bring her into the United States. But it was, and my mother was really, because she remembered several of them, because she left when she was so young, that the 2 younger brothers, she hardly remembered. They were children. Little children. And so, lo and behold, she gets communications from the Red Cross.
From the Red Cross?
Red Cross. From the displaced persons camp in, I think it was in Germany. She has a sister. And the sister has a child, little girl. And she lost her husband, was in the Polish army, never returned, her sister. But she had married someone she met in the camp who saved her life, because she had all kinds of things. He wouldn't have literally stolen food for her, healthy food, because the rations that they gave, I don't know what she had that was very bad, whatever. And so she married him. And of course my mother was, beside herself. And, sent for her. We were in University Park, and because we were in University Park, her niece had a wonderful schooling in high school, because she went to Highland Park.
Oh, so let me see if I've got that. The Red Cross tells her that she's got a sister who's in a displaced persons camp in Germany. And she has
a daughter. Let me tell you what the sister had done, which
Okay.
was remarkable.
Yeah.
My mother had dark hair, you know, a dark, not real dark, but surely not light like my father or like I have. And this sister looked like a typical Polak. She had a very broad face, had blue eyes, and was a blonde. No Jews were blondes. And so she had the guts to take this child, who at that time was probably 7 or 8 years old, if that old, and went to Russia on the trains, walking on the trains, because she had no papers. And she spent a great part of the war, toward the end, in Odessa.
In
Odessa.
in Odessa, really?
War is over, 1945. She begins her long trek, not so long, back. She wants to see what's happened. She's been gone. No trace of any of the family, none. And Gentiles living in the house.
And where was that?
This was in Khmelnyk, which was a fairly good size Jewish town.
Yes.
And in fact, they later, much later, someone published a directory of the Jews from Khmelnyk, because they notified my mother, did she want one? And it listed where they lived and what happened to them, the best that they could find. Anyway, so the war is still on. I'm backtracking. The war is still on. She knew of one brother who lived in Poland who was a communist. He survived with his wife, who was not Jewish. She never knew if they had children until much later. But one brother who was an attorney, now to be an attorney in France or anywhere is a very, not like so much attorneys we have here. And he lived in Paris, went to school in Belgium, and so when the war came, Belgium later did have problems, but not when he was there. So he finished his education and then went to Paris, opened an office, which in those days, you open an office, you have an apartment, and that's where your office is. And this is early in the war, and he knows what's coming. Hitler is marching across Europe, and he finds my mother, and maybe they had corresponded before, I don't remember. And he says, he wants to go into Spain. He has to cross, the Pyrenees Mountains, and without any papers. He will do it at night. He was, fairly young. But could she send him money? He didn't have any money, and of course she did. And the next thing she heard from him, he had indeed crossed the Pyrenees and was in Spain. And then, of course, in Spain happened the Civil War. So he really needed to get out of Spain. And again, my mother sent him money, and he got to England, where he worked. He taught English law at a English university. If you can imagine, that's how bright he was. He was extremely bright. And he also did some work with the Polish underground, which we never knew too much about. He came to the United States once when we lived in Amarillo and Linda was a baby. And, my mother says, why don't you, she remembers that he had a wife and several children, but he never talked about them. So she never asked. She never asked because she doesn't know what happened to them. And if he's not forthcoming with that information, she's not going to ask.
What a story.
So anyway, he came to the United States once. He says, I couldn't live here. And the climax that bothered him, Amarillo was not so big. And we're walking in the street, and in a barber shop window, low, at the bottom of the window, is a sign that reads, so-and-so and so-and-so, an attorney at law. Evidently, the barber's son had gotten a law degree, and in those days, you know, he didn't have the money, so he used his father's barbershop. And this uncle was just, he said, what kind of law do you have here? But anyway, so he never came back. Never came back, died in Paris. Never came, whether he remarried or anything, he never said. And now the brother in Poland is alive and has a daughter. And going through my mother's correspondence when she passed away was a card from this brother in Poland to my mother saying that his daughter will be going to college in Paris. And does she get to Paris? Anyway, she said, had we known earlier, I could have at a time, you know, seen her in Paris. Didn't know until we went through my mother's mail. And had the address at that time where she was living in Paris. And of course, those addresses are not worth anything now. We also found out, reading my mother's mail, that a branch of the family couldn't get into the United States either and ended up in Buenos Aires.
Could we go back to the story you were telling me about the sister who had the child? She looked like a
shiksa is what she looked like. She looked, you know, she didn't look Jewish at all.
And she went back to the town.
Went back to the town, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing's there. And she really, you know, here she has this child, you know, and she had no place to go.
So what did she do?
She went to, they had places to help displaced people.
And what happened to her?
Well, my mother brought her to the United States.
I see. And the daughter went to Highland Park.
The daughter was of high school age.
Uh-huh.
And the interesting thing, how you can work things out with families. A brother, Maury, was in the Army. He never married, but the GI Bill allowed so much money to buy housing after you left the Army, like we bought our first house.
Sure.
And when she came to the United States, my aunt, with her relatively new husband and child, a young lady, I should say, my uncle was very giving, and he said to my mother, he says, he says, I can buy a house because I'm not using. And so he bought them a little, really cottage in East Dallas, off of Easton, pretty far from where we were. But it was a cute little house, and the money he had paid for most all of it. And I think later years he deeded it to them as a gift. And so they lived well. He worked for, my grandparents were gone by then, but he worked in the store. So he had a job. Regine, that was her name. I just lost my friend Regine. But she didn't have to work. He had this, nice little house. And my mother was very pleased. And so when she passed away, our relationship with Sam, her husband, was maintained the same. We helped him, and he, I think he joined the center, and met a few ladies, that type of thing. But the family, now my father's parents were here in the United States. I don't know exactly when they came, but it was because of them that we actually ended up in Dallas. I don't know when they came. Came to Dallas, I think they were about in their 60s and lived in Chicago, but I don't know exactly when they came. My father had no other living relatives except, the brothers. And of the 5 brothers, 3 of them were born in Poland. Only 2 were born in the United States. So it must have been at a time before Hitler. You know what I'm saying? That they came to my fathers, that they came to the United States. Because I don't think they went through the Holocaust. I think my dad lost other relatives, but I have a feeling.
He lost other relatives in the Holocaust.
But I have a feeling that my grandmother and grandfather came maybe in the late 30s, before things got, when they could still leave.
Yes.
They had a sponsor in Chicago, and so that's where they went.
So Chicago's very much in your background.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Very much. In other words, it's a family background, if you will.
Right.
In fact, Linda, my daughter who's a landscape architect, had a young man interning one whole semester with her from Texas A&M, who now has a program. And his hobby, really nice young man, his hobby was, looking up, and he was young, so I don't know who, unless there was someone in his background way back in the United States. Anyway, he mentioned to Linda something, and she went bonkers, as they say, because she asked him, could he begin to look up, on all these, on television today, there's so many, you can't look up. Well, he looked up, how they got up. I'm sure in there is the time, which I don't remember. Mm-hmm. He looked up everything. And you can find everything, what street. Fred and I, both being born in Chicago and so close in age, we lived 2 blocks from each other when we were children. He found out.
Incredible. That's amazing.
We probably passed each other in buses.
Corinne, tell us a little bit about, now you and Fred came back to Dallas.
Right.
Now, how did Fred get into the construction business?
Fred's father, as I say, always owned property in Chicago. Never built anything, but bought existing. The war gave him money, as it did a lot of people, on contracts that he had, and he believed in real estate, Fred's dad. So whenever he got, quote, ahead of the game, he would buy, an apartment building, or this or that. So it was in Fred's, not genes, but it was in Fred's background. When Fred came to Dallas, he decided he didn't want to do ready-to-wear in stores. He really didn't. Because his saying was, it took all your time and it took all your money. Because, it was a 6-day a week, especially in the beginning. And you always had so much money tied up in accounts receivable and in inventory. And you worked really hard. And he said, I don't like it. I don't like it. And he said, literally to himself and to me, and he says, I want to do something in real estate. He says, but I want to build. So, in the meantime, we needed money. So, he got out of the business with my parents, and he had invested already, took his little bit of money out, but not enough for, by then, Marshall had been born, so I had 3 children. 1 5, 1 3, and 1 born. And he says, I've got to do something to make a living. So he decided to travel on the road with dresses, because he was a little more in control of his time than if he had a retail situation. So he had never traveled like that. And he says, I can still see it. He says, one of the best lines that I carried in Amarillo was a Junior Dresses by Jarrell of New York. He says, I'm going to New York. He says, I know the merchandise. he says, I want to see, they never had a salesman on the road, ever. If you bought Jarrell, you went to New York. So, but Fred says it's good stuff. It'll go well in the Southwest because it's really, you know, what's showing, they always have. So sure enough, he went to New York and met the son first. And, you know, Fred was a smooth talker and he knew what he wanted. And he said, talked him into, I'll be a salesman and I'll have Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. And I will attend the shows as well as traveling. Now, you know, Dallas had a lot of shows. And he says, and then so they brought the father in, and the father agreed. So when Fred left, he was the first sales person for Jarrell. But he could control his time.
A lot different than retail.
A lot different than opening and closing a retail. And he did very well. He didn't know customers, you know, but he would pick out, you know, nice stores that sold to young girls. And he did very well. Some of his accounts even flew into market so they could actually see the full line. So he did very well. And in the meantime, he went to New York to the big market, which was always in January. He went to New York twice a year and met, you know, some of his people there. Always checked the books to be sure he was getting the right amount from his percentage. And he would begin to take a Friday off. First of all, he only traveled 17 weeks a year, which leaves lots of time. And then he began to take a Friday off. Later on, maybe a Monday off. But he still continued to show, he still continued to travel. He didn't have a contract. It was just a handshake. And he, you know, would travel some, but it became, you know, 15 weeks. But he never took weeks off. You know, he would take days. Maybe not start out on a Monday, you know. So he finally worked it to where he built his first apartment, which was behind the wall. And now his father built some homes before the apartments. And Fred didn't do much in that building, but he helped his father. And his father built it all in North Dallas, all north of Royal Lane. So it kept his father, he loved it. And Fred hooked up his father with a young Gentile who owned a lumber yard. And because Fred was still traveling, you know, and his dad had had a heart attack. So he needed to make arrangements to where his dad didn't have the full load. And so this nice young man, Fred, you know, put together a partnership. And it worked out very well. And that went on for several years. And then, as I say, Fred gradually, as I say, he kind of helped his dad with the few homes that he built. And then, actually, before he built behind the wall, North Haven opened up. Well, you see all the apartments today near the center? And his father was very concerned. He said to Fred, it's too far out. This is a long time ago. Did not have transportation. And he said, it's too far out. I don't think. But Fred was determined. He said, no, I'm going to buy a lot. And I'm going to build. Fred didn't know that much about building either. The actual, you know. But he says, I'm going to do that. And that's what he did. And his father was, you know, really very concerned. And those are the apartments that literally face the center. But the center was very small then. It wasn't this beautiful thing we have today. And Fred eventually built all of those apartments. He built all of them.
They're
Just
still
one-
good looking.
They're one by, that's what I'm saying. His thing was you build the best. And Fred, closets were, that's why they're still, there are most of them condos now. And he knew what people wanted. They want closets. They want beautiful kitchens. I mean, he knew, and that's what he did. And he did his first one, and it rented. And then he just bought up that whole, all of them. And they weren't big, 12 apartments, I think was 24 at the very end was the biggest that he ever built. So they were small, 2-story. He had, but he sat every Saturday, every Sunday, leasing them. He says they have such an easy time. He says, they hire companies. Now the last one he did have a live-in. That was the most rent. And he had a live-in manager. But other than that, they were too small for managers. I mean, so Fred, and his dad too for that matter. But his dad, they had to be very careful because he always told it like it is.
Because he always...
Fred's dad. And as he got older and not well, he was very crotchety. So Fred did not encourage him to sit to lease because he would say things like we had a tenant come up, a man, and it was on a Sunday. His father was there, and he says to Fred, there's something wrong with the washing machines. He complained about the washing, the building that had the washing machine. And my father looked at me, he says, what is a man like you doing the wash anyway? That's a woman. I mean, so Fred did not encourage his father to sit on the job because he could say things that, but Fred sat. He sat. Today, young people wouldn't sit, but he sat and, showed apartments and, really worked hard. And then he had a cousin that lived in Chicago, Vi, and she was married to a no-good Jewish man, which was rare in those days. He really was not nice to her. And she had a son that was about 7 years old. And Fred, for his cousin, was very unhappy because she was so. And the cousin's father was very close to Fred's father. And so they decided that Vi needs to leave Chicago. And Fred was going to give her a job to manage one of the apartment buildings. She couldn't drive. She couldn't do anything, to be honest. And so Fred told her to come down. She had no money. And they lived with us, with the little boy, for about, Fred was constructing. And they lived with us, let's say, 6 months. And the little boy who lives here now, who is not a little boy, obviously, who has grown sons, and he's a grandfather. He came, I'll never forget this, he came when they lived with us, and he had on a buttoned shirt, a t-shirt like button, immaculate pants, shoes, not regular shoes and socks, and it drove Fred crazy. So he said to Vi, I said, I'm going to tell your son, and I'll find the right clothes, to get in the yard and get dirty. And of course, he today became an accountant and is married to Rabbi Klein's daughter. And has 2 fabulous sons who are both married. And anyway, so her life totally changed. She remarried and just died recently.
I love that story that you just said about Fred telling this boy to get out and to get dirty, because that represents so much, I think, Fred's philosophy of getting dirty, do the work,
That's
work
right,
hard,
exact same
take
thing.
responsibility.
Don't just stand there, all dressed up.
Mhm.
And sure enough, he was.
Quite remarkable. You know, Corinne, I could talk to you, and you are a fabulous interviewee. We have gone almost an hour.
Oh my.
And I mean, obviously you have so many stories. I think we should end on this.
Okay.
And I would tell you that it has been a delight, because what you have told us is a microism of the families, both of whom have worked hard and have made Dallas what it is.
By the way, my grandparents are buried in Sherith Israel. So we're members of Sherith Israel from that time on. So we have 4 or 5 generations now of the Tychers.
It's just remarkable. It's
So
a wonderful Dallas Jewish story.
And Dallas has been so great. That's why you have a Tycher Library, and that's why we've always. And my son in New Jersey totally did also a library in the synagogue in where he belongs. So it goes down to.
It really does.
Because that's how my kids were raised.
And that is your legacy.
And hopefully.
Fabulous.
But it is already.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for giving me the time to reminisce. Really.
Wonderful.